Okay guys, we are going to get started. We have 2 weeks left, so this is the second to the last class. And this is partially where we start to turn a corner. And the corner we're turning is we're going to be looking more at where does America really happen in prophecy. And so we had several things that we presented last time. We talked about Daniel 7 was one of the main ones that we talked about. And it's a picture of a bear, a leopard, and of course a lion, but the lion has eagle's wings, and these wings are actually removed. Okay, and so we talked about how that seems to fit 3 countries that we know of today, Britain being the lion, Germany being the leopard, and the 4 heads represent what we believe will be one more Reich, so we saw the 3rd Reich, and so that's where we kind of focus on that. And then the last beast that the bear also is part of them, but these are the guys that actually form the last beast of Revelation. And so what's interesting is that when this beast comes back together, he has parts of all of them, but he does not have eagle's wings, which means that we, United States, if that's who we are, we may not actually be in that passage. So it's a very interesting thing. So before I go into the rest of everything we do, and this is what I want to show you, so you're going to get exactly what I'm going to say. What we're going to get into the last 2 classes is the most speculative stuff that we've gotten into in a while. It's somewhat controversial. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw two dots, and I'm going to draw 2 other dots here and here. I want you guys to tell me what that is.
4 dots.
4 dots.
4 circles.
What if I start to draw in more dots?
A nose.
Now what is that? Yeah. What if I draw some little dots in here?
Several.
It
Now
looks
what
like
does
a
that
face.
start to look like?
A face.
Well, if we connect the dots, right, then we start to see a more clear picture. Okay? So what we are going to be doing here is we are going to be looking at some of the dots. And these dots come from your Bible. But the picture we make with them, you have to understand that there's some speculation in going on what we're talking about. But this is stuff that's biblical. Now next week, when we come out of what we come out of today, we'll be looking at some other evidences, extra biblical in nature, that might go along with what we're going to be talking about today. So that being said, we want to remember that we are going to be putting some dots out there, and not every dot can be connected. Does that make sense to everybody? So where we picked up is, you guys should be on page 58, and this is a very rarely covered passage of the Bible. Has anybody ever studied Isaiah 18? Well, there's a nation that's named in Isaiah 18, and it's an unnamed nation. So let's read it. It says, "Woe to the land of shadowed with buzzing wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, which sends ambassadors by sea, even in vessels of reed in the waters. Go swift messengers to a nation tall and smooth of skin, to a people terrible from their beginning, a nation powerful and treading down, whose land the rivers divide. All inhabitants of the world and dwellers of the earth, when he lifts up the banner on the mountains, you see it, and when he blows a trumpet, you hear it. For the Lord said to me, I will take my rest, and I will look from my dwelling place like clear heat and sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. But before the harvest, when the bud is perfect, when the sour grape is ripening in the flower, he will both cut off the sprigs with pruning hook, and he will take away and cut out the branches, and they will be left together for the mountains, birds of prey, and for the beasts of the earth. The birds of prey will summer on them, and the beasts of the earth will winter on them. In that time a present will be brought to the Lord of hosts." So this is something that is a judgment that happens, and then something new happens as it goes along. In that time, a present will be brought to the Lord of hosts, okay, to a people tall and smooth of skin, and from a people terrible from their beginning onward, a nation powerful and treading down, whose land the rivers divide, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, to Mount Zion. So when this nation is basically judged, we're seeing something happen, that they bring a present. Somehow it comes to the Mount of Zion. So there's a connection of this country to some type of reconciliation, is some type of action on their half towards Jerusalem. Now, this is, again, it's an unnamed country. So what we have to do here is look at these passages and ask, who might fit this? Well, if you think about this, the buzzing wings in the sky, other translations say a nation of whirling wings, where the sounds of wings are heard, the land of clamorous rings. The reality is, if you look in the world today, certainly not too many countries could really fly. So we tend to think of modern times. And we think about whirling things, we start to think about, you know, helicopters and airplanes. So if you look in the world today, we are clearly have an air supremacy over any country in the world today. Being beyond Ethiopia is a little bit like Tarshish, because it's kind of, again, Ethiopia is there in Africa, so it's more like kind of out east of the Mediterranean. And so it's kind of a broad area, but it doesn't seem to fit the Far East. Doesn't seem to fit Europe, doesn't seem to fit Africa. So where would that be? There's just not a lot of other places where we would be talking about here. This country has a lot of ambassadors that apparently go everywhere, okay? And whatever these ambassadors are, they have a relationship with Israel. They have ambassadors to Mount Zion, okay? So what kind of nation would be involved in that? They have many ships. And this ship is what? Used for trading, but it's also used for what? Military power. In the world today, only China, you know, rivals us with ships of commerce. But in the world today, there is only one U.S. Navy, and we have the biggest, best ships, really the supremacy over the seas. So here we have another issue. This message of warning that goes out to this country is exactly the same warning that the Harbinger carried to the United States of America. And that is following the history of all nations, that when they follow God, they are blessed. When they do not follow God, they are disciplined. And if they will not and cannot wake up to God's discipline, then there could be judgments that begin to fall on that nation. Now, this nation is tall and smooth of skin. It's really weird when you think about it, but the bottom line here, if you think about America, people, we are known for our beauty and fashion industry around the world. And more importantly, people know America by what? Movie stars.
Hollywood.
Absolutely, Hollywood. And how do they basically, you know, how do they propose us to the world? They're basically saying, hey, this is who we are. Well, what kind of people we're talking about?
Plastic surgery.
We have well, that's true, plastic surgery. But, you know, we have HD televisions, you know, and I always found those more comforting because, you know, when you see all the actors on TV and you're looking in here, you know, so-and-so's faces is, you know, it's this big on your screen. Even you're looking like only 8 feet away from him, you're like, wow, I could see every little anything speck on his face. But in the world today, you could certainly see that this is absolutely the way we are portrayed to the world, a land of beautiful people, tall and smooth of skin. So terrible from the beginning really can be translated a few different ways. A people inspiring awe throughout their history. A strong nation, crushing down its haters, feared all over the world, strong and victorious. And of course, here we are, the world's only superpower as we exist in the world today. So when it says powerful, treading up and down, there really is nobody really that really, if you think about America, sometimes we're the world's policeman. So that's what I mean by this treading up and down. We can go wherever we want and intervene wherever we want. Americans have been called the land of 1,000 rivers, okay, and land of rivers. So this prominency on the world stage, whatever we do, clearly is something that people are aware of. So these are just the basic ways in which we fulfill some of this passage about this particular country. And of course, this warning would go out to any country that doesn't follow God, doesn't follow His precepts. Okay, so the net result of this is that this judgment that happens, it's a woe. Something bad happens. I mean, there's some pruning going on, okay? But out of this pruning comes some type of repentance towards Israel. That when you think about they bring a present, you can almost say a peace offering. Some kind of something to make up for something they've been doing, and they bring it to Zion, which is of course Israel. So the Amplified translations, at that time a gift of homage will be brought to the Lord of hosts. And of course we know that it happens in Zion. Okay? So when you think about all of this, you know, and our support for Israel, here we are, and we're going to make a case for this, that we've seen this in our own history, that when you support Israel, you really are blessed, and when you don't support Israel, you aren't. And you could see that if America goes in and makes them divide up that land, you can certainly see how, some of this stuff might happen. Again, this ties into the exact same message that the Harbinger book has for America, that the next phase of God's judgment would have to be worse than 9/11. It would have to be worse than what happened with the stock market in those periods of time. Now we are going to go back to Tarshish, and I have a different map. And the reason we're going to go back to Tarshish is I've actually given it to you, but you all missed it. I knew you would, because Tarshish is really significant, and I'm actually giving you the passage as to why it's significant. But we're going to really point it out to you today. And the reason why Tarshish is a big part of a key to unlocking a possible mystery. So when we think back to these dots here, I want you to think of Tarshish as a big dot. Okay? So this is another article, and it goes through a lot of things about Tarshish, and it brings out a lot of points about Tarshish. Because remember, Tarshish, okay, according to some of the studies we've talked about, could be and probably is Britain. And of course, it talks about the protesters to the Ezekiel 38-39 war, which is the Gog-Magog war, where Russia and a united Arab world along with Iran go against Israel. So this war is protested by Tarshish and its young lions. Okay? So now, if we go back to Daniel chapter 7, again, these guys also agree with me, which means they're really smart. Anytime you agree with me, you're really smart. But they absolutely agree that if you look back to Daniel 7, that the lion with the eagle's wings, they believe also is Britain. And that the fact that the eagle's wings came off means that there was a separation between those two. So they believe that we are the eagle's wings. They also believe that that's why Britain had to exit basically the UK, I'm sorry, the EU, the United Europe United. And so, because they're not part of the old Roman Empire. So remember, we think back to the Daniel 2 vision where the bottom feet, okay, they're partly iron, partly clay, means that there's something new, the clay, but the iron continued on from the legs. And so we know that was the old Roman Empire, so we're looking for maybe a revived old Roman Empire, and Britain wasn't part of that. But you'll see that if they are part of Daniel 7, they end up becoming part of the final beast.
Wait, but Hadrian's Wall, which is built in England, was part of the Roman Empire. Constantine, when he was there, built it right before he was crowned emperor.
They invaded. There's a difference between, they really did invade most of the known world. We know that at some point they did, but historically they were not part of the old Roman Empire. Okay, that's really more of a European thing. And the Roman Empire pressed on, really much farther than almost anybody knows. But the traditional view of the old Roman Empire, they did not control all of Britain and the British Isles, etc., etc. Okay, so that's why people would say historically, yeah, but this is something that people have been saying for a while, that probably the EU that Britain was going to probably exit, and I can tell you that for years. Okay, so this is something that most people would say, most people that study prophecy would say that they didn't control all of that. And the big thing is, it's about what was going on in 70 AD when God's time clock started ticking. Because why has there been a 2,000-year-old gap between the iron legs and then the iron and clay feet? Does that make sense? So we believe it's because Israel wasn't a nation. Okay? So that's why God gave them a second vision, because the second vision tells what 1,900 years later, the three entities that are going to be existing, countries that exist, that form, that come together to form the final beast. And the final beast has all of their characteristics. And even when God comes to destroy them, He destroys the beast, these countries are still left, in existence even after Christ returns. So it's very difficult to parallel that to the old Roman Empire, not to the old Roman, but more specifically to Babylon, Persia, and of course Greece. So it's very difficult because they've been gone so very long. So this is a connection there with the young lions, really being what? If you are a young lion, who birthed you? an older lion. So there's another connection here. Now, there are other translations that don't always use young lions. So that's not 100%. There are different translations about how they say Tarshish and its young lions. Does that make sense? So Ezekiel 38 and 39 brings up Tarshish and talks about how basically there's only two theories on Tarshish. It's either southern Spain, which is right around the rocks of Gibraltar. You see that basically Africa comes up and then Spain comes down, and they kind of form a little sharp point there, and that is the last, what they call Rock of Gibraltar, Hercules, pillars, if you will, on each side, and when you go through that, then you're going out into the Atlantic. Okay, so that's typically where people say that Tarshish is out beyond that, or right there. Okay? Now, the biggest thing about the merchants of Tarshish is that they were merchants. They really had commercial interests, and they have the same kind of commercial interest in the Gog-Magog war. They're really worried about, have you come to take a spoil? Okay, that's what they're worried about. Okay, so not necessarily because it's a Jewish state. So if you think about the United States being possibly one of those young lions, the real problem is that if you look at Operation Desert Storm, we gathered with the same. If you look at Dedan and Sheba, that's Saudi Arabia. So who were the people that came together to support the Desert Storm? United States, Britain, right? And who else? Saudi Arabia. So those are the exact same three people that are protesting somebody invading Israel. So this is another correlation. But did we as a country have trouble going in and supporting and defending what was happening over there with Operation Desert Storm in Iraq? No, we didn't. We were able to get people involved in that. Does that make sense? So the question is, why would we only be protesting and not actually doing any action? Most people believe that this is because America has been in severe decline, that we are no longer a world power. It's very disconcerting that we wouldn't be involved in that war. Does that make sense? Okay. So we think about I want you to get to the bottom of page 60 here. And I think the reason we run into some controversy over Spain or Britain is because originally I believe it really was Spain. But as we know, and this is what we're going to prove to you, that the merchants of Tarshish were even in America. Believe it or not. Okay? And so they basically went wherever they could find something that they could sell to the known world. It was really like the world of Walmart. In a lot of ways, it was also the world's transportation system in some ways as well, because their ships were so seaworthy and they were going from port to port to port. So they really were almost like a civilian type transport system. And you'll see that come out. Okay? Also, if you think about this, does anybody know what the word Hebrew means? Hebrew actually means nomadic wanderer. Okay, so they basically had cattle, okay, and wherever the cattle and sheep and their herds went, that's where they went. Okay, so Hebrew means to pass through. So you think about Abraham, that's what he did. And so they kept the word. In fact, that's what we still call the language today, Hebrew. So if you think about this, Tarshish and the fact that they might move wherever there was something that they could buy and sell and make some money on, does that sound Jewish? Okay, I'm sorry, that was that obvious. So you can start to see there's a few little consistencies here as to why, we might see that come up. Okay? Now, the thing that keeps coming back so many times and again, list all the passages, Psalm 72:10, Isaiah 23:6, 69, and 66:19. Each one of these verses talk about Tarshish and a geographical location associated with isles or coastlands. Okay? Again, we talked about the Straits of Gibraltar. These are some other experts in the field. Dr. Mark Hitchlock, he wrote The Late Great United States. He says that Tarshish was beyond Gibraltar. Okay? He also says that Britain, the young lines would basically apply to America, could apply to Canada, could be applied to Australia. Those are the kind of the big ones. J.R. Church wrote Guardians of the Grail, and he says that an inscription discovered, and we mentioned this before, in 1780 on a cliff in Mount Hope Bay in Bristol, Rhode Island, contained an engraving that read, "Voyagers from Tarshish, this stone proclaims." And this is basically going back to 533 BC. Harvard's found 5 other locations in the United States where merchants of Tarshish apparently had colonies. This is another guy, Dr. David Hawking of Hope for Today Ministries, and this is what he quoted as saying, if you ask me today if the USA is in Bible prophecy, I would have to say on the basis of historical documentation, on the basis of the British Museum, all its records around Glastonbury, and it begins with the Great Britain, Tarshish, and undoubtedly as a seed-bearing people, it refers to the USA as the Young Lions. So these are notable people that have done dramatic amounts of research. I have not done dramatic amount of research on this, okay? I'm really using some of their research, and then I'm going to show you something that I'm very surprised that none of them seem to mention, because if this is a connection with Tarshish, I nearly fell out of my chair, because I couldn't understand how they wouldn't make the next leap that we're going to show you today. So what was it famous for? Tarshish is merchants, and so again, they had vast wealth, especially in metal resources, specifically silver, iron, tin, and lead, and there was also some gold in there. If you look back, and that's Ezekiel 27:12 at the bottom of 61 there. If you look at what they were getting from them, the reality is that they were mining things. Can you have 5 people mining something? No, you have an extensive settlement wherever you are mining anything. A large number of people, a large number of everything. It is a complete community that it would take to mine something. Now this verse was written about 587 BC, and it basically that tin seemed to be one of the main things, and apparently tin seemed to dry up around that time in Spain. But for the last 2,500 years, tin has been mined in Cornwall, England. Of course, right next door in the mountains of Wales, they also have been mining some of the other things that are mentioned there with the gold and the silver and so on and so forth. So certainly they had the sturdiest ships. The Bible says that multiple times, so they would have been able to make it there. And as we'll show you, if they can make it to America across the Atlantic, okay, thousands of years before Columbus, then this really kind of starts to rewrite human history as we know it. Okay? Now, so we know that Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about this happening in the latter days. So there must be a modern equivalent of Tarshish. Okay? And this Tarshish has a relationship with Israel. So if you look at the supporters in the world, if there's really only 2 candidates, Spain, okay, so if you think about the Young Lions of Spain, who would that be? South America, okay? Has there been any interest, okay, on the part of Spain or South America in doing anything for Israel? Absolutely nothing. They really are not a world power. So we would have to think that they're just not a very good candidate because they just don't seem to have a relationship with Israel. Meanwhile, it's exactly the opposite when it comes to Britain. The Balfour Agreement after World War II was started by Britain. World War I was started by Britain, and that's the first thing that made it okay for the people to move back to Israel. Does that make sense? So in a lot of ways, they started, made it legally okay for them to move back. And of course, after World War II, when they did become a nation, who was the first country in the world to recognize them? The United States of America. So this certainly seems to fit that in the latter days, we would have some type of influence and some type of relationship connection to Israel if we were going to be protesters of this war, okay? And that's really just something that hasn't happened. So if you look here at the bottom of 62, here's a couple of clippings about seeing Britain literally as a lion and how they talk about their overseas states, and those are all young lions being with them, okay? So we talked about how, at the top of 63 here, we talked about how the truth is the fact that we're only protesting and not actually doing anything about it should be a little bit troubling to us. To date, the United States has provided $124.3 billion in financial assistance to Israel. So clearly we have a connection, okay? Now, the merchants of Tarshish, this goes down to the, there's a highlighted verse there at the bottom of 63, and this comes, where does this come from? It's Ezekiel, 38. this is a statement from Solomon. I don't seem to have the source of this, but it talks about when he built the temple that they had a navy of Tarshish, and he worked with Hiram, king of Tyre. And this is what it says. For the king had at sea navy of Tarshish with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. Now typically, where do you think the ivory, apes, and peacocks came from? Africa. So clearly these guys had multiple ports. The difference is that when we look at the gold, silver, and ivory, and especially the tin, as we talked about in the other passage, that seems to indicate they had to have had some kind of base in the British Isles. Okay? Now go to page 64. Again, a lot of people believe that Tartessus in southern Spain near Gibraltar was the original Tarshish. Now we'll show you another reason why in next week as to why there's a connection between southern Britain and the British Isles as well. Okay? Now in 1975 this inscription was found in New Hampshire. We talked about the voyagers from Tarshish, this stone proclaims. Okay? Now this is a guy, it's Professor Barry Fell of Harvard University, and he wrote a book about this. He quotes, this is the quote: "The script of itself cannot be accurately dated, but a likely estimate would be about 700 to 600 BC. The voyagers were probably not explorers, but rather merchants trading with the New England Celts, who by that date were already well-established fur trappers and very likely also mining precious metals from those sites where ancient workings have been discovered." So this matches perfectly, you know, the description of what we're talking here, of what the Bible says the merchants of Tarshish really were. Now, not only are there inscriptions found here, but this is probably the most puzzling thing. This is the Las Lunas del Lago inscription. It's called the Phoenician rock, the Commandment stone, or inscription rock, and this is in Las Lunas, New Mexico, so it's here in America. And it is a stone with Hebrew writing on it with an abbreviated 10 Commandments. And so this is very curious because basically we're talking, this thing seems to be about 3,000 years old. So of course that's 1000 BC if we're just dating this. So what is a 70-ton boulder doing in the middle of North America with Hebrew writing on it? That's this old. So when we start to think about Columbus really discovering this country, we really have to say that there's a little bit of, well, there's a little bit of somebody rewriting some history, you know. And certainly he did discover it, you know, in a lot of ways, because these other discoverers never colonized it, at least in the same way. So, and there could be lots of reasons for that, but this is a very interesting thing. Now, if we go back to the story of Jonah and Tarshish, here's some things that come out. Number one, Tarshish ships were basically probably in every single port, okay? They were like the Walmart. They took passengers, I mean, they took Jonah, they took him to wherever he wanted to go, and what did he do? He gave him some money, see? So you have to assume that if people were in trouble, right, and they were fleeing, they might want to go somewhere, they might jump on a ship and goes to Tarshish, okay? So this is really important because maybe somebody else might do exactly the same thing. So what have we really learned about Tarshish? Well, they're famous for their ships. They've been doing, you know, merchandise, obtaining it, etc., really since the days of Solomon. We have the story of Jonah, which corroborates the fact that they're everywhere, that they carry passenger. We have Spain and Britain being the main candidates, but these merchants apparently went everywhere and sold pretty much anything they could do. And again, they had to have some type of extensive settlements in some of these areas in order to mine really anything, okay? The fact that Spain is not really powerful in the end times, the fact that Spain doesn't seem to have, or its young lions don't seem to have really any relationship with Israel, really leads us away from them, okay? And the fact that we have essentially inscriptions in America is really astonishing to me. So, now, this is the verse that I'm really shocked that they haven't really brought up. But this is Isaiah 66, and before I get into read this verse, This is a very neat passage because this passage does a lot of things that the Bible does all the time. And basically, it almost gives you the entire history of Israel in one passage. And a lot of these things are as if it all happens at the same time. And what you'll see, like all things in history for regarding Israel, they have periods of revival where they are blessed, and then they are again go through periods of time where they are disciplined. They might even be completely taken over or dispersed, okay? But God has a mission, and specifically a few passages in there. I always like this passage because it talks about, can a nation be born in a day? Okay, and when no longer is Zion, basically having labor pains when she delivers. And so people really talk about how Israel literally did become a nation in a day. Some of the things it also talks in there about are specifically the tribulation, okay, and it also talks about the millennium. So it's kind of an overall history, again, talking only as God can talk, because to him, he is not time-bound, so everything for him, he can talk about it as if it's now. But during one of these disciplinary times, okay, and we know that in 70 AD there was a major dispersal, but this is what it says here in Isaiah 66:19. It says, I will set a sign among them. So who is the among them? Israel. We're talking about Israel. And I will send those that escape of them unto the nations to where? So what this verse is saying is that literally there's going to be a dispersal of Israel, and that these people groups are going to go where? Well, they're also going to go other places, and we'll talk about some of those, but the one we can do the most research on is really Tarshish. And you notice that it's listed first. What does it say? It says, to pull one, and to them that draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, and where? To the isles afar off, that have not heard of my fame, neither have they seen my glory, and they shall do what? They're going to declare my glory among who? Now, are Jewish people, are Israelite people known for reaching out to Gentiles?
No.
Ever in history?
No.
Never. Okay, the Jewish people still. Okay? Now, Messianic Christians, Jewish people that have become Christians that believe that Jesus is the Messiah, they reach out to the Gentiles. But you can argue, if you look at the entire history of Israel, that you will never see Israel actually reach out and tell the world about the wonderful God that we serve. It's really the gospel that did that. Okay? So, what you can see here is that this is speaking of a future time in which what? That will happen. Where God's people, Israel, are actually going to declare God's glory. And what is God's glory? What is the good news? Jesus Christ, the gospel. So this passage has two things that distinguish this people group. It says right here that they have some kind of connection to Tarshish, okay, and they went multiple places. Again, we don't know whether they survived in these places or not, but the Bible is saying that they went to these places, okay? And it's also saying that these people group later are going to do what God wanted them to do to begin with. Okay, and you know what he wanted them to do, guys? At Mount Sinai, where God really made a covenant and made basically the 10 Commandments, okay? What did the people of Israel tell Moses when he came down with those commandments? They said, Moses, you go worship God, or you go talk to God, but don't let us talk to God lest we what? Die. They were scared, okay? And in that passage, you'll also see that God gave what his will for Israel to be. He wanted them to be a nation of what? Priests. If you have a nation of priests, does a priest need a priest to intercede for some between them and God? Because a priest is, by the way, somebody that intercedes between one person and God. Right? And the Levite tribe among the 12 tribes, okay, was given that role. Their role was to be a priest, okay, hood, line, for who? The rest of Israel. So if all of Israel was supposed to be a priest, then who were they supposed to be interceding for? There's only one option. The rest of mankind. See, so God, did he just, it was only in the New Testament that God loved the whole world?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Right.
They never got it. They never became a nation of priests. And here's a prophetic passage telling us that one day they would spread the news about a good God. It's the same God, Yahweh in the Old Testament is the same as Yeshua in the New Testament. Okay, but we believe that Jesus was that fulfillment, that person where God became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay, so here's a passage, this is a distinguishing feature of this particular people group. So if we ask ourselves, and let's go back to the Common English Bible, and this is where it translates a little different. I'll put a sign on them by sending them out to some of the survivors to the nations of Tarshish, Libya, and Lydia, and the arches of Sicilia and Greece, distant coastlines that haven't heard of my fame and or seen my glory. They will declare my glory among the Gentiles. Okay, so this is a very, very powerful passage to me, because it tells me that this particular people group is going to have to do more with spreading the gospel than any other people group. So let's ask ourselves a question.
We got that.
Okay, has Spain been an absolute proliferator of the gospel? Yes, in some ways. They definitely do score on that list. Okay, but mostly what has it been? The Catholic Church. Okay, if you look at Britain, what kind of role has Britain played in the world today with respect to expanding the gospel around the world?
Protestant church.
Absolutely. More importantly, the sun never used to set on what? The British Kingdom. Does that make sense? In the modern times, if we live in the latter reign, who is the number one, purveyor of the gospel to the world? The United States of America. Okay? So, when we start to talk about this verse, this is where you need to understand some history, because there are only two candidates for who they're talking about here. Okay? When Isaiah made this prophecy, he lived in days when he was earlier in his career. There was a period of time where Israel split into two countries. Does anybody know what those countries are? Israel and Judah. Judah was Judah and Benjamin, the two southern tribes, okay? And they were the ones that basically took the temple. They're the ones who took, the city of Jerusalem. And essentially the kingdoms from the north, the 10 tribes, went off and did their own thing. So we actually have a period of time where we have Israel being the 10 tribes over here, and then we have Judah being the 2 tribes. And you're going to actually see that in prophecy, they are distinguished one from the other. Well, by this point in Isaiah 66, the main prophet to the 10 tribes was probably Amos. Now, Amos lived in Judah, but he prophesied to Israel. He was their prophet in a lot of ways, that God was trying to get their attention before all of this stuff happened. So, when Isaiah says that there's going to come a point where Israel is captured, okay, then it could be either, he could be speaking of a historical fact, because at this point the 10 tribes had been knocked out by Assyria, okay, and they were taken captive, okay? And of course we know from other passages we're going to read that some of those people survived, and some of them even survived in Assyria, okay? So once you understand that there were some survivors, does that make sense? So he could be speaking historically, because at this point that event has already occurred. But there's also going to be a future dispersion of the 2 tribes, which are Judah and Benjamin. And that happens when? When was the first dispersal of Judah? Little country with the name of B. Babylon. So Isaiah never saw this, but Jeremiah saw that happen. And so we're going to see a lot of what he says about the 2 tribes of Judah. Okay, and why do we call them Jews today? Because they come from Judah, from the 2 tribes. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So this is just some history that most people, aren't necessarily familiar with. Okay. Now I talked about these 2 connections here, and we're going to talk about Amos in a minute. Some of the things he said. So go on to 68, and here's the basic history of Israel. Again, around 1300 BC, they were in Egypt. Somewhere between 1200 BC and 1000 BC, they arrived in the land. They went through all the wilderness experience that they went through, and they're in the land. And then the first dispersion happened, was taken in 586. And of course, that was of Judah, and they were taken captive into Babylon. And so Isaiah never quite saw that, although he could have been prophesying about that event. Jeremiah actually saw those days, and Daniel lived through those days, and Daniel, most people believe, actually lived long enough to see the first regathering that happened in 738 BC. This is when King Cyrus of the Medes and Persians actually allowed them to go back to their homeland. So this was the first dispersal and also the first regathering. Okay? So if you have a dispersion, then you're gonna need another regathering. And then, of course, the second dispersal of Israel or of Judah happened when? 70 AD. This is what Christ prophesied to happen in Luke 21. Okay, and this is who he's talking about. So the second regathering of Judah happened when? 1948. And so we saw that Luke 21 was fulfilled in 67 because that was the year that Jerusalem was no longer trodden down of the Gentiles, which means it's trodden down by who? Israel. Okay, God's people. Now the lost history here is that in 930 BC, Israel splits into two parts. The 10 tribes to the north and then the 2 tribes to the south. Okay, and they're called Judah. But in 722, so it was only around 200 years that the northern tribes were conquered by Assyria. And this destruction of Israel, you know, it just didn't make it too long. Okay, it happened in 930, and it was when Rehoboam and Jeroboam were kings. A lot of people believe that because the temple and Jerusalem were in the south, that the northern kings wanted to create false idol worship so that people wouldn't keep going down where? To where the temple is. In other words, they wanted to try and disconnect those people groups and get them to follow them. It really was all about what? Money, power, and influence. And because that, you know, traditionalism that they had, they would tend to want to go where? Back to where Jerusalem was, back to where the temple really was. Okay? So that's why a lot of people believe that Israel was ultimately judged, is because of that. So if we look down here to what happened to them, there's a few different options, but this is a really neat passage in Luke 2, 36 and 38, because when they were destroyed, some of them clearly must have went where? Back south. Okay? And this is a passage that shows that. Now there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age and had lived with a husband 7 years with her virginity. And this woman was a widow of about 84 years, who did not depart from the temple, but served God with fasting and prayers night and day. And coming in that instant, she gives thanks to the Lord and spoke to him of all those who look for redemption in Jerusalem. So what tribe was she from? Asher. Asher is of the northern tribes. So here we have, at the time of Christ, a woman from the 10 tribes that was living where? In Jerusalem. So that means some of them also re-immigrated back to the south when all of this tragedy happened. So the truth is, during the time of Christ, there were basically Israel, Judah, Samaritans, and Gentiles. Okay? All right. Let's go to 69. Now we are blasting through. This is, again, remember, he is the prophet that preached in the northern kingdom. And I'm not going to read this whole front part of the passage because this is exactly what God says he will do to them because of their, again, adulterous generation, which we'll find out that he's going to do here in just a minute. But he talks about slaying them with the sword. He talks about even when they escape, they'll still be killed. It goes on and on. We pick up in verse 7, it says, "Are you not like the people of Ethiopia to me, O children of Israel, said the Lord? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir? Behold, the eyes of the Lord are on the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth." So that's exactly what happened to that generation. Now listen. "Yet I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob." What's the house of Jacob?
Israel.
And Israel is what? Because we just learned now, when we talk about Israel, we could be talking about 3 different things.
God's chosen.
Okay? It is God's chosen. Well, we could be talking about Israel, the 12 tribes. So if we say Jacob, we know we're talking about the 12. Right? Because Jacob is specifically had how many sons? 12 sons, 12 tribes. So Israel is Jacob. So when we think about Jacob, when it says Jacob there, we have to be talking about the 12. Well, we could be talking about Israel with 1 to 12. We can talk about Israel during particular times in their history as 10. And we can talk about Judah as well, and they are the 2. Okay, does everybody see that? Now remember, you're going to see that as we go through this passage, when it starts to talk about Israel, it's clearly talking about all of Israel, all 12. But his main preaching message was to who? These 10 tribes. So this is why he's the one who said this destruction was going to happen to them, and it did. They were mostly destroyed. And this is what he says, after he says he was going to destroy them. Yet I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, which refers clearly to this 12. Okay? Says the Lord, for surely I will command, and I will sift the house of Israel among the nations as grain is sifted in a sieve. Yet not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground. So I believe the fact that he says Jacob here, he's talking about the 12. But when he says Israel, he's talking about the 10. Why do we know that? Because he wasn't a prophet to Judah. Judah wasn't close to being destroyed. They weren't in harlotry, okay, against God, in adultery. They weren't worshiping false gods. He was giving a prophetic message to Israel. And he was letting them know, you are all children of Jacob. And so this promise applies to all of us. But specifically, what does he say he's going to do to them, guys? He's going to sift them. Okay, I mean, to me it's like putting them in your hand and going, and boom, nobody's ever going to see them again. And this is largely what happened in the world today, is that these 10 tribes of Israel, you know, largely just aren't there. So let's keep going here. You'll see kind of how Israel is, the full Israel is brought back together, that this is reconciled, if you will. Okay, all the sinners of my people shall die by the sword, who say calamity shall not overtake them nor confront us. Israel will be restored. On that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David. Now where's the tabernacle of David? Northern or southern?
Southern.
It is southern. It's the 2 tribes, which has fallen down. But it could be just literally referring to the tabernacle of David. A lot of people believe that instead of rebuilding the temple in the last days, that they're going to actually just resurrect the tabernacle. Okay, the tabernacle plan was the preemptive plan until they had the security and wealth to actually build that's where the holiest holies was actually in the tabernacle. Okay, I had to study that many times when I was a kid. I'm scarred. So, and they will come one day possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. And it says, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. Okay? And it says in 15, I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled out from the land, and I will give to them, says the Lord your God. So again, this clearly seems to indicate that there is parts of this that clearly seem to apply to Israel, but when God starts to talk towards the end, he's clearly talking about Jacob and Israel the 12. And this is a little bit, this is why it's a little confusing when you start to get into this. But I'll show you some other passages that are not, they're going to be much more clear that we are talking about 2 different people groups. Okay? So this introduces the idea that Israel and Judah really can be separate, that they are talked about separately in prophecy. So let's go to Jeremiah 3, 8 through 8. That doesn't make any sense, does it? Well, unless it's only one verse, but then why would I put that dash and an 8 there? Okay, and this is what it says. And this tells you the background, because now remember, by the time Jeremiah was prophesying, Israel, the 10 tribes, had already been destroyed, taken captive by Assyria. Okay, and now they didn't listen to Isaiah, and now they were in the part where they were in disobedience and going to be suffering the discipline of God. And I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away. So who's he talking about? Israel the 12 or Israel the 10? The 10. And what did he do? He gave her what? A bill of divorcement. Yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not, but went along and played the harlot also. So what happened to Judah? Exactly. She was dispersed and taken captive by Babylon. So we see the same thing that's happened. But when you think about a divorce, what you'll see here is all the people, and to think about, there's only 2 people we know that made it from Egypt to the Promised Land. Who are they? Joshua and Caleb. Okay? Why did all those people that saw all those miracles happen in Egypt, why did they all die in the wilderness? Because they didn't believe. They were unworthy. They saw the giants that were in the land, and they were what? Afraid.
Yeah, they ran.
They ran. It took another generation to come along and do what? Actually take up the promises that God gave. And this is exactly what we see, that if one generation doesn't take up the promises of God, God will let that generation go. They all died in the desert. But the promises still went on to who? The seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's where it stops. So when we say Jacob, we're talking about 12. Okay? Now, so Judah was destroyed by Babylon, and this passage absolutely proves that we can look at these two entities in history as separate. Now, just so you are aware, there are a lot of people that believe the divorce that God is mentioning here about Israel, the 10 tribes, was a permanent thing. But you can see here in Amos, he says, I know they're going to be sifted and nobody else can find them. They're going to be, to the whole world, just completely gone out, taken by the wind, as it were, okay? But the bottom line is God says what? Not the smallest grain shall fall to the ground. God knows, and we don't. And so this is a mystery that we have here in the Bible, okay? Now let's flip to page 7 here. These are really, we've already covered these passages to a certain extent. This is another one that blends these two people groups. This is Isaiah 11 through 12. Now this, early in Isaiah, okay, we're going to bring this up in there. What's Isaiah 9:10?
Twin Towers.
Nope. Yeah, it's true. But who came it up? What's it called? The Isaiah 9:10 effect. What's the book? The Harbinger. Okay? So earlier, we see that God is trying to discipline Israel, the 10 tribes, okay, early in Isaiah. And then because they don't listen to the warning in Isaiah 9:10, what happens to them? They're destroyed. So this is before they're destroyed. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again a second time to recover the remnant of his people. Now if he regathers them a second time, then that means there has to be what?
Second dispersion.
A second dispersal. When did the second dispersal happen? 70 AD. When did the second gathering happen? 1948. Okay? And what will he do? He will recover the remnant of his people which shall be left. Now remember, in the millennium, okay, so we have the return of Jesus here, and then we have the millennium here. Once Israel becomes a nation again, and then Jerusalem, I believe the Bible teaches that these will actually go into the millennium. I believe that they'll never be uprooted again. I believe that God will reign and rule from there. And so when God talks about coming and getting these and bringing them somewhere, we have to believe that it is possible he could be talking about something that happens in the millennium. But we do know that this happened in 1948. Okay? And we know Jerusalem happened in 1967. So we can see that there is some actual fulfillment on our timeline in our lifetimes. Okay? Now guess where he gets these people from? From Assyria. Who was the main captor? Where did Assyria capture? The 10 tribes. And from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar. Where's Shinar?
Babylon.
Babylon. Who did Babylon capture? Judah. And from Hamath, and from the island, of these islands of the sea keep coming back. And he shall set up an ensign for the nation, and shall assemble the outcasts of who? So here now, why would he go on and say this now? He uses both names. He's going to assemble who? Israel. Now, is it talking about the 10 or the 12? Well, it has to be the 10, because why? Then he comes out and says Judah too. So he specifically uses both of these two names. Whereas he could just say that, and it's all of them. It's redundant. Does that make sense? So it's very interesting here. He's saying that he's going to assemble them. And this could be, we know, and I want to prove to you that the second dispersal that's happening in Jerusalem is specifically to Judah. Okay? When are the other 10 united? Well, we don't know. It could happen anywhere. There are absolutely possibilities that there are some of them there now. Now, this is the reason why I teach prophecy classes 35 years later after arguing with my dad. Jeremiah 12, 1 through 3. It says in the second, it says, "Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling, which is dizziness, staggering, drunkenness, and poison to all the people of the world. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against who?
Judah.
Who's that? Who are those people? What do we call them today?
Jews.
Who's over there in Israel?
Jews.
Jews. See? Right there it says it. That when the world, see, Jerusalem is a completely separate issue. Okay, so when we think about the three end times, Jerusalem is a very, very powerful end time clue as to what's happening in the world today. And sometimes we have to look to some of these other clues as to who the people groups that could be involved. Okay? And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone, an immovable rock, and the people that are going to be there are the Jews. Okay? For all the peoples who try and lift it or go against it will be severely injured or cut to pieces, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. And in that day declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with the woman is wider with madness, but I will watch over the house of who?
Judah.
Judah. Which is why the Jews are over there. Okay? Now, we think through this second patch and you start to see this connection. So we start to see that Britain, okay, could be a place where some of the captives, one of these two people, went. Okay? Now, so you're probably already starting to figure out why this is a little controversial. Why would most people not even give this a second thought, what I'm starting to get to? You're probably starting to see what I'm going to say. Bottom line, it's called mongrelization. These people groups went places, they clearly have been mongrelized. When we talk about how many years has it really been? Well, we have 1900 years here. Man, this wrote really good a second ago. No, it's blue one. So we have Judah, which is really 1900 years. But this one has been how many? I wrote it down there.
2,700.
2,700 years. You think there's a lot of mongrelization that has happened since then?
Absolutely.
Most people would just write this off. I mean, honestly. You're like, how can there really be any ancestral DNA connection here? Well, I can't explain that to you, but all I can tell you is what God's Word does, because somehow He seems to know, even 1900 years later, and God talked about how, Paul went on and on about how there was going to be so many scoffers. When is the promise of His return? When is the promise of His coming? People are laughing at us. 1900 years is enough time, don't you think? But guess what? What is that 1900 years? It is the time of who? Gentiles. Now, do we want this to be a really long time? Yes, we do. Because every year of the Gentiles is a year that what? The gospel saves Gentiles around the world. And that makes the kingdom of God what? Bigger. See what I'm saying? That's what we are called to do. So it's all mercy. Okay? And this mercy is exactly what God has for the whole world. Does that make sense? So it's not because God is slack on His promises. One day is as 1,000 years to the Lord. And 1,000 years is a day. God's not time bound. He's not slack concerning His promises. Okay? But the issue of mongrelization is just where a lot of doubt comes when we start to talk about this stuff. Now, does anybody know what replacement theology is?
Yes,
Okay, what does it say?
that the church has taken the place of Israel.
Absolutely. Why do you think they did that? Do you think it's because they're arrogant? Do you think it's because we think the church is better than Israel?
Because the Jews rejected Christ, and
Yep.
the church became the new Israel.
Absolutely.
The thing is God is faithful though.
Yep.
I mean, he's
The
faithful.
point here is we got time, we have tons of time, and we have lots of mongrelization, right? And then we just, nothing's happening. Does that make sense? So we can certainly see that the bride of Christ is what God came for, you see, and God really has always loved the Gentiles. He wanted Israel to be a nation of what?
Priests.
Priests. The gospel has always been God's heart. He didn't suddenly come up with this plan. Okay, does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
So, but here's the thing. You can't say that God made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then suddenly cut out 10 of the tribes. Because if, okay, God's still going to keep his promise to Israel, then he's going to keep his promise to all of Israel. It's very difficult to really make a good case. This verse even says it. Whatever Israel got punished for, who went and did it right next? Judah. Okay. Now, I will tell you that I did go through a divorce myself, and it was very comforting to know that God had to divorce somebody, because it can get that bad. God can't put up with everything. But I do believe exactly what it says in Amos, that even though he scattered them like the wind, not one of them is lost on his part. So while it is clearly above and beyond what we can understand, God somehow seems to know. And my point here is that when they say you can't have your cake and eat it too, you can't say, I don't believe in replacement theology, and then have no possibility for where these 10 tribes are at in the world today. Okay? Now, here's the real bottom line. They show up in Revelation. All 12 tribes. So what is Revelation, guys? It's called the end of the story. So when we come out the door, okay, Revelation's here. We have all of the 12 tribes. Now, most people believe that there is a tribulation here, and these 12 tribes come out or are redeemed during the tribulation, which means there have to be some of them here. Okay? So we have all 12 tribes that somehow are in the tribulation, and what is the tribulation also called? Whose trouble? Jacob's trouble. And out of Jacob's trouble, what do we see? Jacob's children being saved and redeemed, exactly the same way that they were promised. And that the times of the Gentiles will one day come a close, and then we will see there's only 7 more years left that God, according to Daniel, left to deal with who? Jacob's children. And that means all 12 of them. And all 12 of them are here. So whatever happened 2,700 years ago, somehow God knows, and that this is an effect that's actually happening in the world today. And more importantly, there's a link with Tarshish in the Alliance. Okay? Go to page 71. So this is what I mean by we skip to the end of the story. Now, just so you're aware, Israel is not the only people saved in the tribulation. If you go down, these 12 tribes, okay, are all there. This is the 144,000. 12 times 12 is what? 44. There's 12,000 of each tribe, okay? Now, if we go down to just the end of the 8th verse, listen to what it says. A multitude from the great tribulation. After these things I look, because he talks first about how he sees the 12 tribes, 12,000 of each of them sealed, okay? And that means, what does it sealing mean? It says, after these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, and the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or in any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was granted him to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have what? Sealed the servants of our God on their what? Foreheads. Okay? Now remember, I have said this before, but the Punjabi religion actually believes, and this is where you see the serpents coiled around the spine, and he actually comes up into here and he actually clamps down on something called the pineal gland. And a lot of people believe this is where the hallucinogenic drugs seem to be able to affect this lower brainstem area. And this is how they can what? Begin to see and communicate with what? The spiritual dimensions. So when we think about the seal in the forehead, what's going to be released on the face of the earth? These people are going to be protected. So when we think about the rapture of the church, is the rapture of the church the only way that God can protect people during the tribulation? No. And don't forget it. Okay? Because before he unleashes all this, what does he do? He sends out and he allows them to do what? Mark them, seal them in their foreheads, so that they can be what?
Protected.
Protected. Okay? So it's the same thing, when the plagues fell on the land of Egypt, where did they not fall? The land of Goshen, where God's people were. This is a great passage here. It says, after I looked and I saw, behold, a great multitude, which no one could number. So while we got 144,000 of Israel, listen to this multitude. And they were of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne, before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, salvation begins to our God, who sits on a throne, and to the Lamb. So here we have a great multitude. And what are they, guys? Who do you think those people are, this multitude?
Gentile?
Absolutely. They're Gentiles. Okay? So here we have a passage that's saying that Jacob's trouble is going to what? Come back and save. Okay, and of course, when Jesus comes back, that will usher in the millennium, okay, and the millennial reign. And this is how all of God's promises really to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob
Complete. Yeah.
really it becomes complete. Does that make sense? Now, I've had a lot of people say, Kevin, you really believe that those people are really Jews? You really think that? I had one guy even say to me, well, even Hitler didn't believe that those people were really the Jewish people. And I go, do you not know a lot about Hitler? Because Hitler was a complete occultist. So if you were an occultist, okay, and you knew that these people weren't original, then you would for sure leave them alone, because you wouldn't want that deception to be postulated. On the other hand, if you were an occultist and you believed that they were the real people, you would go in and try and kill every last one of them. That's what you would do. The fact that Hitler was incessantly trying to kill them in his occultic connections is the biggest reason, in my mind, that it has to be some real truth to it. Does that make sense? Here's the other bottom line. Jesus said it. He said, one day that Jerusalem will no longer be trodden down of the Gentiles. And so we have a people claiming 1900 years later, yeah, it sounds crazy, but it's true. Okay? At least on God's level. Some way or another, they have common alleles with those people. There is some kind of ancestral connection, and that's why I believe that we need to support Israel. Even though we have all this time, even though we have all these 1900 years, yes, they have been marginalized, but somehow or another, they qualify as the seed of Jacob, and the seed of Israel, that God, fulfilling and doing what he's going to do there, is somehow going to complete his promises that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? Now, we already talked about this thing, but this is going right back to Isaiah 66, which opened up the can of worms about Tarshish. But it talked about, who's ever heard of such a thing? Who has seen such a thing? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day, or shall nation be born in one day? For as soon as where? Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. Where is this country going to be? Zion. Where is Zion, guys?
Israel.
It is in Israel. And where is Zion in Israel?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Okay, go to 12. For thus says the Lord, behold, I will extend peace to her like a river. Okay, and what else is he going to extend like a river?
Glory of Gentiles.
The glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. And what does it say at the very end? It says, and you shall suck, and you'll be born upon her side, and dandled upon her knees, as one his mother confronts. So will I comfort you, and you shall be what?
Comforted
In Jerusalem. So this is why I say, we have a huge amount of vagueness here. We have no vagueness here with Jerusalem. None. Okay, Zion is Zion, Jerusalem is Jerusalem, and the rest of these things, I mean, we just have to say, how do you want to connect the dots? Does that make sense? Now, this is the biblical case. There's some more biblical cases I'm going to make that we very well could have connections of Israel and Judah. I'm going to make a few more points to Tarshish in the next week. And they'll also be going over some other informations that are extra biblical that also go along with this. And then I'm going to do a nice summary. But I think we blew you away today, and you can see why. Certainly, I'm like, I have known about this possibility about some things with the 10 tribes. I've studied it a little bit to go, well, nobody has any idea, but I mean, they make it to the end, so it's a mystery, and I'm just gonna let God take care of it. And then all of a sudden, I get into this study, and they start talking about Tarshish and Tarshish and Tarshish, and I'm going, my goodness. I think I almost connected 2 dots. So what I'm trying to say is, you look at how many dots I had to draw in there before you could see a smiley face. We connected a couple dots. So we don't need to jump to any conclusions, okay? But it is something that came up. And so that's why I'm like, if this is biblical, it's in the Bible, then I can say it. Does that make sense? On the flip side, exactly what does that mean? Well, we'll show you at the end how it could affect a few different things. And it does answer a couple of questions I've had about other prophecies, and we've already covered them. But I'll go back and show you what I mean in those passages and show you how it could be a different slant to a lot of things, and where is America at in prophecy. And maybe there is a reason why some things have been happening to America. Okay, let's pray. Father God, we just pray a hedge of protection about every dot we drew today. And we know, Lord God, that you have a mystery going on in the world today, that your promises are true. Every promise you made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we don't really understand it all. We have to accept it by faith. But as we go into the end times, it's also possible, Lord God, that we may uncover some things with the way things could happen in the future. And more importantly, Lord God, as to where America could be in the future. And I believe that America has an awesome opportunity right now because of this election. We absolutely saw a clear miracle where you have given us more time, Lord God, with the First and Second Amendment, Lord God, to have our freedom of speech, Lord God, to be free in this country. And I pray that we will use it every day. And more importantly, Lord God, I pray that we will not be like that Isaiah nation that we studied today, that we will not be full of woe, but rather, Lord God, that we will repent and we will see a great revival in America. And I ask, Lord God, that we will watch over everything we say and do in this class, and let it always be to your glory. In your name we pray.